On a cold December night in 1993, Rose Larner left a convenience store on her way to a boyfriend's house. But she was never seen or heard from again. Rose Larner's disappearance remained a mystery until a tiny clue found years later uncovered a tragic tale of drugs, romance, and revenge. Rose Larner was the second of 3 children in a broken family. She was a highly intelligent but very difficult teenager.
Rose Larner was an 18-year-old girl who liked to spend a lot of time out at night with her friends, away from her family, a family that dubbed her the vampire because they only saw her in the daytime.
Rose's best friend, Bill Brown, was a boy she had known since 2nd grade. They remained friends even after high school.
First girl I ever got a kiss from. Her and 2 other girls came down to our house and they chased me through the woods, and my brothers held me down and she gave me a kiss. And we was just basically friends. We had crushes on each other, but nothing serious, and we were just kids.
After high school, Rose worked at a pizza shop in her hometown of Lansing, Michigan, and started dating a friend of Bill Brown's, John Ortiz Kehoe.
He came on quite polite. He was a local star, rap star. I mean, everyone thought he was just it, you know. This was John Kehoe. And when I first met him, I thought he was all right.
Rose, John Kehoe, and Bill Brown were inseparable, spending their days and most of their nights together. For a time, Rose and John Kehoe lived together, but the relationship didn't last. Kehoe moved out, and Rose was devastated.
John, at some point, decided that he wasn't interested in Rose and tried to break it off. Rose wasn't real keen on that idea.
On the night Rose disappeared, she stopped in to visit her mother, who was working at the convenience store. Rose said she was headed to the home of her friend, Keith, who lived nearby.
She walked up to my work and told me she was walking over to a boyfriend she had at the time. Her and John were split up, and I asked her not to. I told her I had a bad feeling about tonight and to go back and get the van, but she didn't want to do that.
Rose preferred to walk that night instead of driving and did not return home. The next day, Rose Markey called her daughter's friend Keith, who said that Rose never showed up. Rose didn't show up for work that day either.
Rose ran on the wild side. She was independent, rebellious, and it would not have been out of the realm of possibility for her to have simply left the area and gone look for another lifestyle.
Rose Larner made approximately 1,500 telephone calls every month, but no one heard from her after she disappeared.
Nobody heard from Rosie. And the detective that was assigned the case, that was his sign that there was something wrong there. Because he said that someone just doesn't break a habit like that.
Rose Larner's mother still hoped for her daughter's safe return. Perhaps something in Rose's phone records would provide a clue. After 2 weeks went by with no word from Rose Larner, Lansing police began one of the most intensive searches ever undertaken in central Michigan. They dragged area rivers, coordinated search teams to look for clues in the surrounding neighborhoods, and investigated every lead.
The persistent rumors, Rose is in so-and-so's backyard, Rose is in so-and-so's basement. And I'll admit, we dug up a few basements and drained a few gravel pits looking for Rose, with nothing. Came up dry every time, nothing.
Police learned that Rose Larner spoke with her ex-boyfriend, John Ortiz Kehoe, on the night she disappeared. Kehoe had an alibi for that night. He was on a date with another woman. Bill Brown was with Kehoe and his date on the night Rose disappeared and corroborated Kehoe's alibi. For the next 2.5 years, police could find no trace of Rose Larner.
You're simply stymied, you're stalled. That was where the police were at the time, 2.5 years after she disappeared.
The state police began their investigation with a fresh look at Rose's ex-boyfriend, John Ortiz Kehoe. They quickly discovered that Kehoe and Rose Larner had an unusual relationship, one that continued even after they broke up. In one incident, Rose followed Kehoe to this fraternity house near Michigan State University. Kehoe was on a date with another woman. In a fit of anger, Rose drove a van into the side of Kehoe's truck.
She was smashing her mother's van into his truck, breaking out his windows. We'd come out my parents' house, and she'd be hiding behind trees.
Police also learned that Kehoe and Bill Brown were in business together, the drug business, and had customers all over Michigan.
We as a task force put a lot of pressure on Bill Brown. I mean, we were talking to family members, we were talking to friends, we were talking to neighbors, we were talking to all kinds of people who had been approached before.
Brown and Kehoe were together on the night Rose Larner disappeared. But police did not believe that Brown had told them everything about their activities that night.
I knew it was going to be very hard, very, very hard for them to be able to get a case. I knew the only way would be is if people started talking.
Bill Brown originally said he knew nothing about Rose Larner's disappearance. But 2.5 years later, under constant police pressure, he changed his story. And it was a story so shocking, few believed him.
When Bill Brown was sitting there in the office, we were hearing things that we had never heard before. It was an eye-opener.
After listening to his whole story about what happened to Rose Larner, I literally went home and told my wife that I felt like I'd just met Satan. I almost stopped on the way home and went into a church that I didn't belong to. It was the most unsettling thing that I've ever been through, to listen to that.
And police needed science to determine whether Brown was telling the truth. After 2.5 years of searching for Rose Larner, Bill Brown finally revealed what happened on the night she disappeared. Brown said that on December 7th, he unexpectedly ran into Rose Larner near the convenience store. Rose told Brown she wanted to see John Kehoe.
Rose is begging me to page John, and so I finally do. I page John, and she asked me to ask John to come pick her up. John says the only way he'll agree to that is if she agrees to have sex with both of us.
Brown said Rose agreed. They drove to John Kehoe's grandparents' home because they were away on vacation. Rose changed her mind about the threesome. When she did, Brown said Kehoe murdered her and dismembered her body. Brown said they cleaned every square foot of the house, removing all of the blood, bone, and debris. Later, they drove to a cabin owned by Bill Brown's parents where they burned Rose's body. Afterwards, they spread Rose's ashes along miles of highway throughout Michigan. Brown said he didn't come forward sooner because he was afraid Kehoe would murder him as well.
All I wanted to do was get away from him. I just wanted to get away from him. And after that, he basically kind of kept me hostage. I mean, he wouldn't let me out of his sight.
After 2.5 years, police finally had the break they were hoping for, but they needed to know if Brown was telling the truth.
He'd been involved in the drug scene, that he ran with this group that would fight. Violence was a part of their world. He ran with a rough crowd.
Brown said Rose was murdered in the bathroom. Police sprayed the area with luminol, a chemical which can reveal trace amounts of blood even after it's been removed with water and detergent. But they found nothing. On a hallway carpet, the luminol revealed what appeared to be the imprint of a bloody bucket. But after 2.5 years, there was not enough blood to perform DNA testing. Investigators feared they were at a dead end until they noticed a small spot on the wallpaper just outside the bathroom.
It had the color consistent with blood, and it had kind of the configuration of what you would suspect if a blood droplet was falling down a wall.
The spot looked like part of the wallpaper pattern. To see if it was blood, scientists performed a phenolphthalein test. A wet Q-tip was rubbed over the spot. Then, phenolphthalein and hydrogen peroxide were applied. The Q-tip turned pink, a positive, presumptive test for the presence of blood.
Of course, we didn't know whose blood it was. Keep in mind, just because we find a drop of blood, I mean, it could be the grandparents, it could be anybody's blood that we didn't know for sure.
You know, in my mind, I'm thinking, you know, could this be a blood drop of Rose Larner? And at this point, you know, of course, I got very excited and thought, you know, what if this could actually be from our victim?
Scientists were able to extract enough blood from the wallpaper for DNA analysis, but they had nothing to compare it to. In Rose Larner's case file, police learned that she had been involved in a sexual assault 4 years earlier. After the assault, a sample of her blood was taken and still existed in police custody. The DNA profile from the blood on the wallpaper matched the DNA from Rose Larner's blood sample. The odds of the blood belonging to anyone else were 1 in 747 million.
Identifying it as Rose Larner's is what's remarkable. That tells us that Rose Larner was in that house at that time. That corroborates what Bill Brown told us. That was crucial.
Brown also revealed that they both rinsed rags soaked with Rose's blood in the basement sump pump. Forensic scientists gathered all of the debris from the bottom of the drain. They also excavated the fire pit near Bill Brown's parents' cabin, where Rose's body had allegedly been burned. The search resembled an archaeological dig.
My job at that site was to excavate the fire pit and collect any remains, any evidence in that fire pit that might be relevant to the case. Specifically, I was looking for evidence for human bone, human material.
The fragments were analyzed with an ultraviolet light in order to determine whether they were bone. Under ultraviolet light, bone will glow.
The fragments that I did end up finding were very, very small. Probably none of them were larger than the size of a pea. So initially, when all the dirt and debris was in there, it was very difficult to tell what we had.
The bone chips were too damaged and degraded for DNA analysis, but they were analyzed to determine if they were human. Magnified 100 times, human bone is circular in structure, while animal bone seen here is more linear. The bones found in both sites were clearly human. The number of circular structures in the bones, or osteons, increases with age. There were relatively few osteons in the bone chips found in the debris.
We were able to determine that the remains were clearly human, and in some cases they probably represented somebody who was a teenager or in their early 20s.
People just don't find bone fragments in their house, and it corroborated with the bone fragments that we found in northern Michigan at the site where on Bill Brown's property, where they took her and burned her remains.
The blood and the bone chips were exactly where Bill Brown said they'd be. Police were now convinced that Rose Larner had been murdered. According to Bill Brown's confession and the forensic evidence, prosecutors now knew what happened to Rose Larner on her last night alive. Shortly after visiting her mother at the convenience store, Rose ran into her childhood friend, Bill Brown.
Hi, Rose.
Hi, Billy. Let's go get John.
Fine.
At Rose's suggestion, they picked up her ex-boyfriend, John Kehoe.
I'm gonna go inside and grab some stuff for the night's festivities.
John Kehoe bought some supplies for the evening, including a hatchet, a knife, and some lighter fluid. Brown said he was not aware of the specific items Kehoe purchased until later that night. Once at Kehoe's grandparents' home, all three took a shower together. Kehoe again tried to initiate the sexual threesome, but Rose refused. At the sink, without warning, Kehoe strangled her. In the shower stall, Kehoe slit her throat and dismembered her body, using the knife and hatchet he purchased at the store. Brown and Kehoe spent the next 2 days cleaning the blood, bone, and debris. A bloody bucket left the stain on the carpet found years later with the luminol. Rags soaked with blood and bone were rinsed in the basement sump pump, where tiny pieces of bone were also discovered. And a blood spot on the wall was identified as Rose Larner's through DNA testing. Her body was burned in an outdoor fire pit. After the cremation, the ashes were dumped out of the car window as Kehoe and Brown drove back to Lansing.
I did say a prayer for her right afterwards, and I'm not a religious person, but I did pray for her soul. And at that night and many nights after, that's about all the thought I put into it. All the other thought was in saving my butt.
The bones in the sump pump, the luminol impression of the bloody bucket, the tiny speck of blood on the wallpaper, and the bone fragments in the fire pit all confirmed Brown's story. Before police could question John Kehoe, he fled the country. After a 6-month international manhunt, Kehoe was finally located.
I saw him for the first time in Mexico. He was drinking a beer in a bar. 4 minutes later, he's sitting in U.S. Customs hands on the other side of the bridge. It was like slam, bam, and he's out of there right now. I don't think he knew what happened.
At the trial, Kehoe had a ready defense. He claimed that it was Bill Brown who had murdered Rose Larner.
John Kehoe was going to point the finger at him and say, well, gee, I didn't do it. I was just there, and he killed my girlfriend. He went nuts on coke and killed my girlfriend. We knew that was coming.
But prosecutors argued that Bill Brown had no motive to kill Rose Larner. John Kehoe did.
His motive was the problems that Rose Larner was causing for him in the days and weeks prior to her disappearance. She was embarrassing him. She smashed his truck. It was typical for Rose not to be intimidated by this guy and to simply get into arguments with him and call him names, not back down. That was Rose Larner. And this, I think, was something new for John Kehoe, and it angered him. It really angered him.
Although the crime occurred 2.5 years earlier, Rose Larner was still able to speak to the jury through the power of forensic science.
In this case, I don't take the position that we didn't have a body. I think we did. We just had very small pieces of it. So, I mean, they basically gave us a body.
The jury deliberated just over an hour.
We, the jury, find the defendant, John Ortiz Kehoe, guilty of first-degree premeditation.
Kehoe received Michigan's maximum sentence, life in prison without possibility of parole. Rose Larner's grave is empty. All that remains of her body are the tiny bone fragments which are still in evidence.
I hope John Kehoe lives a long time in prison. And I hope he thinks of Rosie every day that he's in prison. I feel a person like that would rather die than to be in prison the rest of his life, so I feel that that's a just punishment. But if he were to die, I hope it's brutal.
Bill Brown was sentenced to 1 year in prison for helping cover up the murder. He is now out on parole.
If I would have known what was going to take place, like I said, I wouldn't have been there. She wouldn't have been there. Never would have happened.
The way I feel about it is that by convicting John Kehoe, I just saved other people's lives, other young girls' lives. Because I just feel that it was his nature and that he enjoyed killing Rose Larner and that he would do it again.
On June 6, 1996, in a suburb of Dallas, Texas, there was a crime of unprecedented horror. An intruder entered this home and attacked 2 young children along with their mother. Police hoped that science would lead them to the assailant.
My babies are dying, they're dead!
Darren and Darlie Routier were a young couple in their mid-20s with 3 children, 6-year-old Devin, 5-year-old Damon, and 8-month-old Drake. Darren Routier was a successful entrepreneur. Darlie stayed at home to care for the children.
This was a young couple who had made good. Darren owned his own business. In 1995, he had made close to $300,000 in his business. He repaired mainframe computers, had some extensive contracts with government agencies.
On the night of the attack, Darren Routier was asleep upstairs with 8-month-old Drake. Downstairs in the family room, the 2 older boys fell asleep watching television. Their mother, Darlie, was asleep on the sofa. Around 2:30 in the morning, an intruder stabbed the children, then woke Darlie, who felt a knife at her throat. After a brief struggle, the intruder fled, and Darlie called police.
911, what is your emergency? Somebody came in while I was sleeping. Me and my little boys were sleeping downstairs. Somebody came in, stabbed my baby, stabbed me. I looked up, I was fighting. He ran out to the garage, threw the knife down. My babies are dying, they're dead. Oh my God.
When paramedics arrived, 6-year-old Devin was dead. 5-year-old Damon was barely alive, but he died en route to the hospital. Darlie was taken into surgery to repair her neck wound, which missed her carotid artery by only 2 centimeters. She also suffered a stab wound to her arm. Paramedics noticed that Darlie's panties were missing.
When I asked her if she thought she'd been raped, her answer to me was, well, when I woke up, I felt some pressure down there. That was her answer.
But a rape test was negative. Darlie described the assailant as a white male about 6 feet tall, wearing a black shirt, jeans, and a baseball cap. A screen in the Routiers' garage had been cut. Darley said the intruder dropped the murder weapon onto the floor as he fled. In the alley, 2 houses away, police discovered a bloody sock. The motive did not appear to be robbery.
Between the kitchen and the room where the murders occurred, there was 13 rings and a gold lady's watch laying out there. So it indicated to us if it was in fact a burglary or a robbery that had gone bad, there was nothing. There was valuables out there to be taken and nothing was disturbed.
Now we don't know why. Now we know that this is a sick individual that took absolutely nothing from our house, but took the two most important things that were important to us away from us.
The most prominent evidence at the crime scene was blood. Forensic scientists hoped the blood spatter pattern would tell them more about these horrific murders. When police examined the murder scene, it appeared the assailant entered the Routier home through a screened window in the garage. Darley Routier said she was asleep when the intruder murdered her 2 boys. Darley woke when she felt a knife to her throat. There was a struggle, and the assailant fled through the garage. Darley said he dropped the murder weapon onto the floor on his way out. Darren Routier said he was asleep upstairs with 8-month-old Drake and woke when he heard glass breaking.
When he walked into the family room where the detectives were waiting for him, the first thing out of his mouth was not, "How is Damon? How is Darley?" It is, "Have you seen Darley? Isn't she beautiful and doesn't she have gorgeous breasts?"
Darren said, "You know, I can see why somebody came in, good looking blonde, 38 double Ds." Frost thought that was a little strange too, considering he had just lost both of his sons, and I don't believe at that time he knew for a fact if Darley was going to live or not.
In the kitchen, police noticed a set of white-handled knives. One space was empty. It appeared the murder weapon, a 10-inch white-handled knife, came from the Routiers' own kitchen. The blood drops on the floor were photographed and collected for DNA testing. The size and shape of the blood droplets would be analyzed to see if they were consistent with Darley's version of events.
Darley's nightshirt was another important piece of blood evidence. Forensic scientists hoped that it too would provide information about the murders.
DNA testing of the bloody sock found in the alley revealed the blood was that of the 2 boys, Devon and Damon. However, police bloodhounds were not able to track the intruder's scent beyond the location of the sock.
Why would an intruder leave a murder weapon behind in a house and yet take a sock down the alley? Why would an intruder leave this sock in open view for the police to find instead of disposing it in a garbage can or down a storm sewer drain?
Police found some other inconsistencies. Darley said she chased the intruder through the kitchen and he knocked a wine glass on the floor. But pieces of glass were on top of the blood drops on the floor, and there were no cuts on Darley's feet. Underneath the overturned vacuum cleaner was more blood spatter and a wheel impression in the blood. It appeared that Darley ran through the kitchen before the glass broke and the vacuum cleaner overturned. On the handle of the vacuum cleaner was a blood stain. DNA test revealed it was Darley's. The blood dripped onto the handle at an 80-degree angle, as if Darley were leaning over the vacuum cleaner. The pattern was not consistent with Darley's running past the vacuum, as she told police. Either Darley Routier was mistaken about what happened in the kitchen, or she knew more about the murders than she was telling police. Blood spatter expert Tom Bevel was asked to analyze the blood drops found in the Routier home. As co-author of a well-known textbook on blood pattern analysis, it was Bevel's job to interpret the story told by the blood trail. Bevel noticed the blood drops on the kitchen floor were circular in shape, meaning they were deposited by someone standing still or walking very slowly. Darlie said she was stabbed on the sofa and while bleeding ran through the kitchen after her assailant. But running would have produced blood drops more elliptical in shape, usually with a tail indicating the path and direction of the person running. Darlie also told police that the intruder dropped the knife onto the kitchen floor, but Tom Bevel could find no evidence of that.
Numerous people, to include myself, examined that floor to try and find evidence of a knife drop, either even pointed straight down or falling on its handle or falling on its side or whatever. And we were unable to find anything that would be consistent with that. If it had as much blood on it as it was found, which it would have to, then it should have produced an outline of a knife or evidence of the knife dropping onto the floor. And we simply didn't find that.
Barry Dickey is a forensic audio expert assigned to analyze Darlie's telephone call to police. In order to conduct his analysis, Dickey isolated Darlie's voice by eliminating all of the background noise.
Somebody came in while I was sleeping. Me and my little boys were sleeping downstairs. Somebody came in, stabbed my baby, stabbed me. I woke up.
In my opinion, Darlie had moved from at least 3 different rooms in the house. And these rooms were moved in a very rapid fashion, and she did not stay in any one of the ambiances very long.
But if Darlie walked briskly in between rooms, this contradicted her story to police. When police interviewed Darlie after the murder, she was holding a wet towel to her neck wound. Police wondered if the towel had been used to clean up blood before they arrived. To find out, investigators used luminol, a chemical that glows when sprayed on an area where blood has been removed.
Once we darkened the kitchen down and applied the luminol, we were able to see footprints there in front of the sink, which kind of made the hair on the back of our neck stand up.
The footprints in front of the kitchen sink were Darlie's. On the cabinet beneath the sink, there was visible blood, and luminol revealed that more had been cleaned up before police arrived.
The blood evidence in front of the sink indicated to us that someone had bled, had stand there in front of the sink for a significant amount of time bleeding and not moving around. There was blood drops on top of blood drops in the floor in front of the sink.
DNA testing revealed the blood belonged to Darlie. Prosecutors suspected that it was here where Darlie cut her neck and arm.
If there was an intruder and he came in without leaving any evidence of walking through there.
Also on the carpet was an unusual blood impression, the distinct outline of the murder weapon. The heavy line of blood near the tip of the blade told forensic experts something important about the killer.
The only way that I am aware that you could get something coming off of the knife in that manner as we found it would be to have the knife in the hand of a person that is bleeding. In other words, they are contributing blood continuously. So if you had a wound on this arm with the knife in this hand, with the blood flowing down the arm, ultimately across the hand, and then down the blade of the knife, that will produce that very heavy bleeding that we've got in the front of the knife in the impression.
Coincidentally, Darlie had a knife wound on her right arm. DNA tests revealed that the blood was that of both Damon and Darlie, and not that of an unknown assailant. Darlie said she picked up the knife from the kitchen floor and put it on the counter. She said nothing about taking it into the family room.
No bloody trail, no fingerprints, no trace of a suspect. I mean, Peter Pan came down the chimney maybe and committed the murder, but Tinkerbell or somebody. But we have no evidence of anyone coming through the window, committing the murders and leaving.
Police were now convinced that there was no intruder in the Routier home on the night of the murders. Just 8 days after the murders, the Routiers celebrated what would have been Devon's 7th birthday at the cemetery. family members invited a local television news crew to attend.
Happy birthday, dear Devin.
If you knew Devin and Damon, you would know that they're up in heaven, and they're up there having the biggest birthday party that we could ever imagine. And they wouldn't want us to be down here being sad, even though our hearts are breaking. I know that Devin and Damon would want us to be happy.
District Attorney Greg Davis watched the celebration on television.
I was just sickened by what I saw, because it had only been a week since these boys' deaths, and yet we've got a full-blown birthday party out there at the graveside. And it really struck me as more than curious.
At the Dallas County Institute of Forensic Sciences, Charles Lynch discovered the most damaging piece of evidence contradicting Darley's intruder story. On one of the bread knives from the routier's kitchen, Lynch found a single fiberglass rod and some rubber dust. The cut window screen in the routier garage was made of polyvinyl chloride bundles. The interior core of that bundle was composed of fiberglass rods. The fiberglass rod found on the kitchen knife was identical to the fiberglass rods from the routier's screen. Lynch could not find any other source of fiberglass inside the routier home that was similar.
So I was able to eliminate all other sources of fiberglass that I could find as being the source. So the conclusion is that a fiberglass rod found on the bread knife may have come from the window screen, but not to the exclusion of all other sources.
FBI profiler Alan Brantley was convinced there was no intruder.
We have never seen a case where an offender comes from outside the residence, breaks into the home, takes a knife, and then goes back outside the home and cuts the screen to come back in. Those steps, that kind of behavior is just unnecessary to the commission of any kind of an offense, unless you're attempting to make the scene look like something you think it should look like or that you want other people to believe occurred. And again, that's an element of staging.
And on Darley's nightshirt, scientists found cast-off blood spatter on the back right shoulder area. DNA testing revealed that the blood belonged to the two boys.
Some of those blood stains are coming in a direction consistent with the movement of the item that was bloodstained. In my opinion, in this case, the knife. As you're drawing the knife backward, the blood is coming off of the end of the knife as it's being drawn backward, and of course, if it's close enough and it's still in an upward flight, it will point in an upward direction with the blood stains.
The blood spatter was pointed upwards, consistent with the movement of a bloody knife in Darley's right hand. The forensic evidence all told a story quite different from the one Darley told police. Prosecutors believe that the murders were premeditated and that Darley encouraged the boys to sleep with her that night in the family room. Sometime after 2 a.m., Darley took a bread knife from the kitchen and cut the screen in the garage. She returned the knife to the holder without rinsing the fiberglass residue found later by forensic scientists. Darley used the largest knife she had to murder her two children. Blood spatter on the back right shoulder of her nightshirt placed the murder weapon in Darley's hand. Speculation is that Darley may have removed her panties to suggest the possibility of a sexual assault. Standing at the kitchen sink, Darley turned the knife on herself, slicing both her neck and right arm. Then something unexpected happened. 5-year-old Damon was still alive, crawling through the family room. He was stabbed 2 more times. The knife impression on the carpet was caused by blood from her arm wound as it dripped over the tip of the knife. The audio analysis of the 911 call reveals that Darlie was moving in between rooms quickly as she staged the crime scene and removed some of the blood evidence. But Darlie's attempt to mislead investigators failed.
It's hard to explain it, but these kids were in her way. They were in the way of her lifestyle and her ambitions and what she wanted to do. And she simply made a decision that those children would no longer be in her way.
Darlie Routier was arrested and charged with the murder of her 2 sons. Darren Routier denied he was involved, and no charges were filed against him. Patricia Springer described the possible motive in her book, Flesh and Blood.
There is no one reason why Darlie Routier did this. It is a combination of things. It had nothing to do with money. It had to do with the multiple births, with the total responsibility. We've learned since then that Darren really didn't help a lot with the children. They painted this picture of the perfect family and how great they were, and everything they did was as a family. But the family knife was an illusion that they perpetrated on anyone that would listen to it.
Darlie Routier was found guilty of first-degree murder and was sentenced to death. She currently sits on death row, awaiting execution.
Texas is a pretty conservative state, and I want everybody to know that you can't go out and kill our children and expect to live.
I think that Darlie got exactly what she deserved in this case. We probably gave her more justice than she deserved in this case. If you look at the barbaric acts that brought her to that courtroom, we did all that the system allowed us to do to her. But she richly deserves to be on death row, and she richly deserves to be executed one day.
1964. Scott was a ladies' man, and while it wasn't unusual for him to be seeing a number of women at the same time, his date on this night raised more than a few eyebrows.
Hey, everybody. This is my lady friend Shayna.
Sometime during the party, Scott became ill, so sick he was unable to drive home. A few days later, Scott Dunn disappeared and was never seen again. Four-year-old Scott Dunn was a fun-loving young man who enjoyed life to the fullest. Scott lived in Lubbock, Texas, settling there after serving in the U.S. military. He worked for MGM Electronics in a job he loved, installing custom sound systems in automobiles. The last time friends saw Scott was on May 13, 1991, at a party after work. Scott was a prankster and decided to add a little excitement to the festivities. His date that night wasn't a she at all. She was really a he, a transvestite. Before the night was through, Scott's friends eventually found out and weren't amused. Later, while still at the party, Scott became ill. He was so sick he couldn't drive home and stayed overnight on the sofa. The next day, his live-in girlfriend, Leisha Hamilton, drove over to pick him up.
He looked like crap. He couldn't hardly walk. You could tell he'd been in bed all day. He wasn't showered. He wasn't clean. Clothes on all awkwardly. Couldn't get dressed by himself.
After spending another full day in bed, Scott told Leisha he finally felt well enough to return to work.
I woke up that morning. He was in bed with me by then. Asked him how he felt. I asked him, did he need a ride to work, because he didn't have his cars there. He said no, his friend was coming for him, and just asked me to get him a glass of water and some sinus medicine, which I did, brought it to him, and then I left. When I came home, he was gone.
When Scott's friend stopped by the apartment to pick him up, there was no answer.
No one ever would answer, so just never heard from him.
2 days later, Leisha called Scott's father in Pennsylvania to see if he had heard from Scott.
And it's a young woman's voice, and she goes into, I don't know if I'm talking to who I'm talking to, but I assume you're Scott's father because I found the telephone number on the telephone bill. And I said, well, that's right, I'm Scott's father, but who are you? She said, well, I've been living with Scott for a couple of months now. Sometime we've been together for some time. And I said, well, I don't really know who you are.
Jim Dunn filed a missing persons report with the Lubbock Police Department.
What was he wearing last when you saw him?
Police wondered whether Scott Dunn's personal life held some clues to his disappearance. When Scott Dunn disappeared from Lubbock, Texas without a trace, his friends told police this was out of character.
The way Scott was, he would have called at least and said, hey guys, look, I'm out here in Mexico, hanging out, partying, something.
Scott's live-in girlfriend, Leisha Hamilton, told police that when she returned from work, Scott was gone. She also said that a large piece of carpet was missing from under the sofa. When police searched the bedroom, they discovered that another piece of carpet in the bedroom had also been removed and replaced with the carpet from under the sofa. Along the edge were some rust-colored stains.
The staining along the edge of that patch in the original carpet was very evident to anybody that's been doing this for any length of time. It was blood.
When the carpet patch was lifted, police noticed it was held together with duct tape. On the under padding was another large stain which also appeared to be blood. In one spot, it had soaked through a hole in the padding to the cement floor underneath. And it looked as if someone had washed blood from the baseboard. To find out, investigators used a chemical called luminol, which can detect areas where blood has been cleaned up with water and detergents. The luminol revealed a scene of horrific violence.
You can actually see the pattern, you can see where blood had been, and my initial reaction was that something had occurred in that apartment.
It was stark. Somebody had very obviously tried to clean the whole thing up and had done a fairly good job of it.
I just knew that he was dead. Felt very confident that he was dead. It was probably the longest day of my life, and it was the most devastating thing that had ever happened to me.
But who would want to kill Scott Dunn, and why? Dunn had a previous arrest and conviction for possession of cocaine, but the theory that this was somehow drug-related was inconsistent with the crime scene.
If it was a drug hit, they probably would have left the person there, wanting everybody in the world to see so that nobody else would cross them. And this crime scene was covered up, and the only reason it was covered up was because it was trying to be hidden.
Police also discovered Scott Dunn was leading a secret life. While living with Leisha Hamilton, he continued to date numerous other women.
He was wild. He played the field. He had, in my opinion, he had a history of using women for his own purposes. In fact, he was engaged to be married to a young lady in the Metroplex while he was living with Leisha Hamilton.
Leisha Hamilton learned about Scott's engagement just 1 month earlier.
Who's calling? His fiance? Yeah, I'll be sure to tell him you called.
And I think at the point where that telephone call came is when Leisha realized she had been had by Scott. And Leisha herself was a user, and when it became apparent to her that she in this situation was not the user but was in fact the usee, she became enraged.
But was that sufficient motive for Leisha Hamilton to murder Scott Dunn? And if so, where was the body? Leisha Hamilton continued to call Jim Dunn from Texas, keeping him informed of the investigation into Scott's disappearance. But she asked for something in return. She wanted Scott's yellow sports car. Jim Dunn taped those telephone conversations.
You seem to want the car, and I have promised you the car when this is all over, but you don't seem to want to wait.
Actually, I don't. I don't need it. It is a want right now, okay? The only thing I want is this car. That's the only thing I've wanted from the start. That's the only thing I want now.
A background check by Lubbock police revealed that Leisha Hamilton had a past arrest in New Mexico for embezzlement. But if Leisha was involved in Scott's disappearance, why had she helped police by pointing out the missing carpet in their apartment? Leisha told Scott's father that she thought a man named Tim Smith had something to do with Scott's disappearance.
Tim Smith was a guy that lived in the apartment near Leisha. He had been brought up in a very strict, very religious environment. My theory was that this was the first real contact he'd ever had with a worldly woman, and that he became enamored with her and the way she made him feel, and he just fell head over heels in love with her.
Police discovered that Smith did not show up for work on the day Scott Dunn disappeared.
Tim Smith. Lubbock Police Department.
When police visited Tim Smith's apartment to ask a few questions, they noticed he was packing to move.
We're investigating the disappearance of Scott Dunn. Whatever I can do to help. Mind if we take a look around?
Sure, go ahead.
When they walked back into the living room, they noticed that something that had been sitting on the bookshelf disappeared.
Where's the roll of tape?
What tape?
The duct tape was there on the shelf. I don't know what you're talking about.
But behind some books on another shelf, police found what they were looking for, the duct tape that was on the shelf just a few minutes earlier.
That was a stroke of luck, but it's also good investigative work. I mean, how many times do you walk into a place where a guy's moving and see a roll of duct tape and think nothing of it?
The duct tape was sent to the forensic laboratory for analysis. The tape in Smith's apartment looked very similar to the tape on the carpet patch in Dunn's apartment. The samples were analyzed using infraspectrophotometry, where infrared light is passed through the duct tape.
And the detector will determine how much wavelength of light is being absorbed at different wavelengths.
The results are then printed out in a chart.
In the case of Roger Scott Dunn, the duct tape we separated out into its components. The fibers that run along in the duct tape, the backing of the duct tape, and the adhesive of the duct tape. As you can see, the infrared spectrum from the roll of duct tape found at the suspect's house and the duct tape found at the scene are consistent in the fibers component, the backing component, and the adhesive component.
And the roll of tape held even more clues. On the side of the roll were green nylon fibers, trilobal or triangular in shape. They were the same size and shape and made of the same polymers and dyed the same color as the carpet in Scott Dunn's bedroom.
I feel confident that the fibers on the side of the duct tape came from the apartment and that the duct tape underneath the carpet came from the roll of duct tape.
But without a body, authorities were hesitant to conclude homicide.
A lot of it had to do with the body. We had no body. And the district attorney's office at that time was very apprehensive to try to take something to trial where you had no corpus delicti, is what they say.
A full year passed, and Jim Dunn decided to take matters into his own hands. He heard about a group of international forensic experts who meet several times a year in Philadelphia to study unsolved murders. The group of 82 members is called the Vidocq Society, named after Eugene Francois Vidocq, an 18th century French detective considered to be the father of modern criminal investigation. One of the co-founders of the Vidocq Society, Richard Walter, agreed to listen to Mr. Dunn's story.
Well, after about an hour and a half of me showing pictures and listening to some tape recordings and things I had, he looked me straight in the eye and said, Jim, aren't you tired of being the grieving father?
And he looked at me and he said, I thought I was supposed to be. And I said, no, you were supposed to be goddamn mad. Let's go after that bitch.
Richard Walter was convinced that Leisha Hamilton held the key to Scott Dunn's disappearance. Walter sent the crime scene photos to Dr. Richard Shepherd, a forensic pathologist at Scotland Yard in London. After reviewing the information, Dr. Shepherd concluded that Scott Dunn had been murdered in the corner of his bedroom, the result of multiple blunt trauma injuries. But at the time, under Texas law, without a body, there was no homicide. Armed with Dr. Shepherd's forensic analysis, Richard Walter pleaded the case to the district attorney, arguing that they had a body part.
He said, what part of the body is that? I said, blood's connective tissue. He said, he looked, gave me a long look, and he said, all right, you got her, murder.
Prosecutors brought in their own blood spatter expert, Tom Bevel, to confirm the findings of Dr. Shepherd. According to Bevel, the blood spatter pattern on the walls indicated 3 distinct lines of cast-off blood from a weapon.
For example, if we had 3 cast-off stains that were going in 3 directions, that would be consistent with 3 blows, plus the one to create the blood in the first place. So in this case, we'd say there was a minimum of 4 blows that was delivered.
To find out how much blood Scott Dunn lost during the assault, Bevel conducted a blood saturation test. By pouring human blood onto a test piece of carpet, Bevel created the same size stain found in the bedroom, in this case 266 square inches. It took just under 2 units of blood to create the stain and soak through to the padding underneath.
If you take that in consideration with all the other physical evidence there, such as the blood cleanup, the cutting out of the carpet, the blood spatter, the cast-off that's to the wall and also to the ceiling, along with that blood volume, it certainly is a high suspicion that somebody in fact is dead.
Authorities were now convinced that Scott Dunn had been murdered in his bedroom. Lubbock police suspected that both Leisha Hamilton and Tim Smith were somehow involved in Scott Dunn's murder, but they had no evidence linking Leisha to the crime, and the only link to Smith was the duct tape. until Richard Walter discovered something that was previously overlooked. Walter learned that several strands of unidentified hair had been found on the duct tape in Scott Dunn's bedroom. He suggested the hair be sent for forensic analysis. At the FBI lab in Washington, D.C., the hair from the duct tape underneath the carpet was compared to hair samples from Leisha Hamilton and Tim Smith.
No Scott Dunn hairs were found on that tape, but both the hairs of Leisha Hamilton and Tim Smith were found on that duct tape holding it in, which means that when that duct tape was put down and that patch put in place, they were there.
5.5 years after Scott Dunn's disappearance, Leisha Hamilton and Tim Smith were arrested and charged with murder. Prosecutors believe that Leisha's motive was revenge, that she was angry when she learned that Scott was engaged to another woman.
She's hard as rocks, bright, aggressive, works, smart, but has this insatiable appetite for power, control, crushing people. She dismisses you, you don't dismiss her.
Leisha Hamilton was the absolute instigator, ringleader, and she was the Wicked Witch of the West who contrived, developed, led, and covered up this whole thing.
Prosecutors believe that Scott Dunn was murdered in the early morning hours of May 16, 1991. He was asleep in the bedroom and struck at least 4 times with a blunt object. About 2 units of Scott's blood was lost in the attack. As Scott's body was removed from the apartment, his blood was transferred onto the bedroom doorknob. The location of the body is still unknown. The cover-up failed because the water and detergents could not remove the hemoglobin components of the blood, which later fluoresced when sprayed with the chemical luminol. A piece of carpet from under the sofa in the living room was used to patch the blood-stained carpet in the bedroom. The duct tape used to patch the carpet together contained strands of hair, consistent with hair samples from both Leisha Hamilton and Tim Smith. And the side of the duct tape picked up some stray carpet fibers. The roll was later found in Tim Smith's apartment. Leisha Hamilton and Tim Smith were tried separately, and both were convicted of murder. Leisha Hamilton was sentenced to 20 years. Tim Smith received a 10-year probation.
The jury, I think, believed that perhaps he had a great deal to do with disposing of the body, but they didn't believe he was actually there when the murder took place. And I think for that reason, they recommended the judge impose probation instead of sentencing him to a term in the penitentiary, which would be carried out.
Although the body of Scott Dunn has never been found, a headstone waits, and a father still mourns.
I'm just hopeful that at some point somebody will talk and that we can recover his remains and still we can have a decent burial and a decent ceremony that we can put him to rest. And I'd feel totally absolved at that point that I'd done everything that I could do if I can ever reach that point. I haven't quite reached that yet, and I still crosses my mind what else I can do, but at this point I'm going to let it go and hope that somebody, the good Lord or somebody, will give us some direction. I'll know what that actually means in my life at some point.
On a windy October night in 1995, a mysterious house fire swept through the palatial home of a doctor and his family. 2 of the family members made it out alive. 2 of the children did not. In the debris, medical detectives discovered much more than simply how the fire started. Michael Farrar and Deborah Green first met in medical school in 1977. Both were gifted students with near genius IQs. There was an instant attraction, and they married less than a year after they met. Over the next 16 years, the couple raised 3 children, Jennifer, Timothy, and Kelly, in an affluent suburb of Kansas City, Kansas. To outsiders, their lives seemed perfect, but the marriage was showing signs of stress. At the North Kansas City Hospital, Dr. Michael Farrar was a successful heart specialist who worked very long hours, often at the expense of time with his children. Deborah quit her own medical practice when the children were born. She battled depression, weight gain, and was rumored to have a drinking problem.
You got the impression that Deborah wasn't the easiest person in the world to live with. She was, I don't want to say, well, let's just leave it at that.
In an effort to rekindle their marriage, the couple decided to go on a school trip to Peru with their son, Tim. While sightseeing along the Amazon River and among the Incan remains, an attractive blonde nurse caught Michael's attention. She was the mother of one of the other students. When they returned to Kansas City, Michael continued to see his new friend, which soon blossomed into a sexual affair. It didn't take Deborah long to find out about her husband's affair. She moved into a separate bedroom, and her drinking increased.
Her whole identity was her marriage and her family, because she didn't, she no longer had her own career. I felt that, you know, maybe it was just really hard for her to let go of that. Maybe she felt like she could change, or something could change, and they could somehow stay together.
And Michael had some serious problems of his own. Shortly after the Peru trip, Michael developed diarrhea, vomiting, and chills so severe he was admitted to the local hospital.
He'd been in South America, where he might have had access to a whole variety of things that could make him very sick.
Despite undergoing a full battery of tests, doctors could not determine the cause of Dr. Farrar's illness.
When I saw him, it's like, Mike, man, you look bad. I'm sorry, but you don't look good. And he said he'd been really, really violently ill since he had gotten back from Peru, and he assumed that he got some tropical parasite from hell.
Michael Farrar was rapidly losing weight, dropping to just 125 pounds. Whatever was causing this illness was a mystery. For a cardiologist who seemingly had it all, Dr. Michael Farrar's life in 1995 was one crisis after another. When he was released from the hospital for the illness many believed he caught in Peru, Michael took another step towards divorce by moving into his own apartment across town. His wife Deborah was angry, depressed, drinking heavily, and would stay in her bedroom for days at a time. Michael was concerned for her welfare as well as the safety of their 3 children. While visiting the house to pick up some of his things, Michael noticed something suspicious in his wife's purse. A packet of castor beans. On the label was a warning that the beans were poisonous. With so many packets of castor beans in her purse, Michael suspected that his wife was planning to commit suicide.
So he was telling me that he was pretty sure she was going to try and kill herself with these poisons, which really to me didn't make any sense because Dr. Green is a bright woman, I mean, she's an extremely bright woman, and is an oncologist. And if you're a doctor, I mean, doctors kill themselves, all right? I mean, and professional people do commit suicide. But fortunately, we've got the best of drugs available to us. I mean, if you're going to go, why would you go stooling yourself to death? I mean, you aren't going to want to die with bloody diarrhea. I mean, that is a very horrible, bad way to die.
Dr. Farrar decided to do a little investigating of his own. The castor beans were purchased from the Earl May Garden Center. A receipt from that store in Deborah's purse indicated she purchased the beans just 4 days before Michael first got sick. While consulting his medical textbook, Farrar learned some terrible news, that castor beans contain ricin, a deadly toxin with no known antidote. And the symptoms of ricin poisoning were vomiting, nausea, diarrhea, and gastrointestinal bleeding, symptoms which were identical to his own. Farrar quickly took a sample of his own blood for testing, but ricin leaves the body quickly, and the lab could find no trace of it in his system. Although he had no proof, Farrar was convinced that his wife had somehow poisoned him with ricin, and this was the cause of his mysterious symptoms. A few days later, Michael confronted Deborah during an angry telephone call.
I told her that I was very angry with her, that I thought she was crazy, that I thought she had been poisoning me, that I thought she needed serious psychiatric help.
I don't have to listen to this.
One hour later, around midnight, a fire broke out in the Farrar family home. By the time firemen arrived, the home was totally engulfed in flames.
I've never seen a fire spread as fast throughout the house as I have in this one. The heat was tremendous. There was no way that anyone could even get close to the house. Of course, the flames were roaring out probably 20 to 30 feet.
Deborah and her 10-year-old daughter Jennifer both escaped. During questioning on the night of the fire, Deborah learned the tragic news that her other 2 children had been trapped and died in the fire.
Oh God, beautiful Jim and beautiful Kelly are both dead? Jesus Christ, did they make any attempt at all to save them?
6-year-old Kelly died of smoke inhalation in her own bed. 13-year-old Tim burned to death.
Christ, I saved one of the kids, and I could have gotten the second one out and didn't. I'll never forgive myself for that.
Investigators immediately suspected arson.
It's fair to say that Deborah Green was a suspect early on. It's fair to say that Mike Farrar was a suspect early on.
Both had motive. Both had opportunity. If the fire had been deliberately set, the charge would be more than arson. It would be murder. While investigating the suspicious house fire that killed Tim and Kelly Farrar, police looked a little deeper into the relationship between Michael and his estranged wife, Deborah. A few weeks before the fire, the couple had a fight at the house. Michael said his wife was intoxicated, angry, and threatening to kill herself. The police were called and took Deborah to the hospital for psychiatric evaluation. Dr. Pamela McCoy was the physician on duty.
Pam McCoy indicated that at first she was somewhat skeptical about whether or not Deborah Green was really that mentally ill. And is sitting there in the waiting room of the KU Medical Center emergency room, talking to Deborah Green about these issues, asking her if she's okay, if there's anything she can do to help her, and trying to get a read on her mental state. When in walks Michael Farrar.
When they met in our kind of entryway there, she just like turns on him like she's, I mean, for a minute I kind of hold her like I think she's going to physically attack him. And she spits at him and calls him a cope. And then she says, "You're going to get these kids over their dead bodies."
Deborah said she made the statement in anger and denied having anything to do with the fire. She said she was asleep when the fire alarm sounded. She said she opened the bedroom door, saw flames and smoke, closed the door, and ran outside through a door in the bedroom.
Tim, can you hear me?
Deborah said she told her son Tim to stay inside until firemen arrived and ran to the next door neighbor's house for help. To find out whether an accelerant or flammable liquid was used in starting the fire, arson investigators used specially trained dogs that can identify vapors which remain after the fire.
This is a dog that has been through several weeks of training on how to detect different types of liquid accelerants like diesel fuel or kerosene or gasoline or charcoal lighter fluid.
The dogs identified a number of suspicious areas. Investigators found melted plastic containers on the floor, possibly used to carry flammable liquids throughout the house. Next to Dr. Farrar's desk, investigators found another clue that the fire had been intentionally set.
We found an empty liquor bottle laying on the floor right behind this desk. Again, it's possible that the contents of this bottle were poured out and ignited on the desk.
A section of the basement floor had what appeared to be a pour pattern, where an accelerant was ignited as a test. The accelerants also gave investigators a clear path of the fire. The path led directly to Deborah Green's bedroom door.
That fire was set at that bedroom door with the intent of doing a tremendous amount of damage to that house and cutting off the escape route of those children upstairs.
And the analysis of the burn patterns on the bedroom door contradicted Deborah Green's story. Deborah said her bedroom door was closed when the fire alarm sounded and that she closed the door before running outside for help. But the carpet underneath the door revealed the door had been opened. The door jamb revealed the same thing. If the door had been closed, the door jamb would have been protected from the fire. Instead, it was completely covered with soot. In the bathroom was Deborah's bathrobe, wrapped in a ball on the floor. On the underside of the robe were burn marks. At some point, the person wearing the robe had been very close to the flames. The neighbors said Deborah's hair was wet when she ran over asking for help. This did not come as a surprise to arson investigators.
When Dr. Green actually ignited that accelerant outside of her bedroom door and in the hallway, that there was enough vapors present that there was quite a flash, more of a flash than she probably was prepared for. When she did that, I believe that is when she got the hair singed on the right side of her head.
With a search warrant, detectives took a sample of Deborah's hair. Microscopic analysis revealed that Deborah's hair showed signs of heat damage consistent with singeing from a high-intensity flame. The damage to Deborah's hair was extensive since the sample wasn't collected until after she had her hair cut for her children's funeral. Bill Chapin is a forensic chemist whose job was to analyze the fire debris evidence from the Farrar home. Fire debris is stored in metal canisters which preserve any vapors which may still be present. The canisters are heated to between 80 and 90 degrees centigrade, and the air inside removed. If the vapors contain accelerants or hydrocarbons, they're trapped in charcoal filters. The filters are then rinsed with a neutral solvent, carbon disulfide, and the mixture is placed into a gas chromatograph mass spectrometer for analysis. After 2 days of testing, Bill Chapin found what he was looking for.
In this particular case, the accelerant that I found was an accelerant called isoparaffin. Isoparaffins are often used in odorless charcoal lighter fluids.
There was an empty container of charcoal lighter fluid on the floor of the Farrars' garage. Investigators were now convinced that Deborah Green set the fire that killed 2 of her children. The only question that remained, had she also tried to kill her husband with castor beans? When Dr. Michael Farrar told police he was sure his wife had been poisoning him with castor beans, investigators were unsure of where to start. Since the local laboratory could find no evidence of ricin in Michael Farrar's system, his blood was sent to the FBI, to Dr. Drew Richardson, an expert in chemical and biological research at the Naval Medical Research Institute in Washington, D.C.
People in the intelligence community are quite familiar with ricin based on a handful of cases that most everybody would know about. Very few people in the lay public and even highly trained professionals such as medical doctors would be quite unlikely to know much about ricin, if anything.
Ricin is an antigen that causes a breakdown of red blood cells at the tissue level. In large enough doses, it can be fatal. When an antigen enters the body, the immune system's response is to produce antibodies which fight the invading organism. To find out whether ricin antibodies were in Michael Farrar's system, Dr. Richardson used a technique called ELISA, which stands for enzyme-linked immunosorbent assay. A 96-well plastic plate is coated with a solution containing ricin. In theory, any ricin antibodies in Dr. Farrar's blood would bind to the ricin coated on the plate, which is exactly what happened. Next, Dr. Richardson analyzed the blood of goats that had been exposed to small amounts of ricin. It appeared that the goats and Michael Farrar both had similar antibodies in their systems. Antibodies designed and structured to recognize and seek out the target invader, ricin. Dr. Richardson discovered something else. The number of ricin antibodies in Farrar's system was staggering.
In the case of Dr. Michael Farrar, it's thought that perhaps he was exposed 3 times. A certain immune response would have been produced the first time, a response that would have lasted a few weeks. On second and third, and perhaps other exposures, a separate immune response would have been produced. For each one of those exposures, and the latter exposures would have produced a response and antibodies that would be present in the blood for, again, many months to perhaps a few years.
Deborah Green was charged with 2 counts of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. Prosecutors believe that when Deborah's attempts to kill her husband failed, she feared losing custody of her children in the impending divorce.
I don't have to listen to this.
After the argument on the telephone, prosecutors believe that Deborah poured accelerants throughout the house, with special attention to Michael's possessions and making sure to cut off the children's escape route. The path of the accelerants led directly to the door of Deborah Green's bedroom. But she used too much accelerant. The vapors ignited, causing a mini explosion that singed her hair. While dousing her head with water, she saw that her bathrobe had also caught fire and discarded it. Ten-year-old Jennifer survived by crawling out her bedroom window and jumping to the ground. Deborah told Tim to stay inside with his 6-year-old sister until firemen arrived. Sadly, Tim did what his mother had told him to do. He and Kelly both died before firemen could reach them. Deborah Green's trial was scheduled to begin 1 week after Michael's brain operation to repair damage caused by the ricin poisoning. But the trial never took place. Deborah Green pleaded no contest to the charges, avoiding a possible death sentence.
My attorneys are ready, willing, and able to present evidence that I was not in control of myself when Tim and Kelly died. However true that may be, defending myself at trial on these charges would only compound the suffering of my family and my daughter.
She was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole for 40 years.
Well, I think these kids in this case were sort of the ultimate pawn, the ultimate weapon that Deborah Green used in this fight with Michael Farrar. She, in some ways, probably loved those kids, in other ways viewed them as an expendable resource to be used in this war.
Shirley and Ed Andronowicz were regulars in a neighborhood bar a few blocks from their home in Winnipeg, Canada. On one of their nights out, Ed decided to leave early. Shirley wanted to stay. There was a brief argument, and Ed went home alone. It was Shirley Andronowicz's last night alive. Ed and Shirley Andronowicz had been married for 20 years. Ed was a construction worker, Shirley was a housewife. They lived in the Fort Rouge section of Winnipeg, Canada, with their 3 teenage daughters.
They went out that night together, and just as usual, they went out for a good time. And I guess a few hours later, my dad came home. He was tired, he didn't want to be there anymore. She just wanted to stay, and his friends are there, so she stayed with his friends.
Shirley left the bar around midnight and walked home.
I heard her come home that night. She was by herself. I don't know if she was drunk, but you could tell that she had been drinking.
Ed and Shirley argued again when she came home. Ed said Shirley went for a walk to calm down, but never returned. The next morning, an employee at a nearby high school discovered a woman's body in the schoolyard.
It was a very gruesome scene. There was some very senior homicide detectives that were there that were a little taken aback of what was discovered there.
They came to the door, and I went and got my father. I went upstairs. Then I got called downstairs, and the police looked at my father and said, "Do you want to tell her?" And he just kind of hung his head and kind of nodded, and they told me. They told me that, you know, we found your mother. She's been killed.
Shirley Andronowicz had been sexually assaulted, beaten, and mutilated, with bite wounds over much of her body. it appeared that she had been strangled, then hit with a large piece of concrete.
There was the destruction of the facial features, and there was an obvious sexual assault had taken place. So this was a definite gruesome scene.
I've been a prosecutor for 23 years, and I have never seen any case with as much brutality to a human body.
In a written statement, Ed Andronowicz admitted that he argued with his wife that night, but said he had no idea what happened to her after she left their home. Homicide investigators Bob Marshall and Ron Oliver decided to question Ed Andronowicz again to learn more about what happened on the night Shirley Andronowicz was murdered.
At one point, he was sort of asked in a sort of a helpful sort of a question to him if he had any idea who may have killed his wife.
12:30 in the morning.
The answer Andronowicz gave was a bombshell. He said he was the murderer.
He actually had some knowledge of some of the aspects of the crime. For example, he knew where the body was. He knew that it was in behind the Grant Park High School.
I was angry with the police. I mean, they thought it was my dad, and I was angry with people who thought it could even be my father, because I knew it wasn't. And not only should they just, you know, knowing my father, know that he could not have done that, but trust my word, even though I was only 14.
To make absolutely sure, police questioned Andronowicz again on the following day, and again he confessed. Ed Andronowicz was charged with second-degree murder. Ed Andronowicz was held in a Winnipeg jail after confessing to the murder of his wife. Although parts of his confession were inconsistent with the murder scene, Andronowicz said he had been drinking on the night of the murder and his memory wasn't entirely clear. Police began their forensic investigation by turning to Dick Monroe, a forensic geologist with the Winnipeg Police Department. The murder weapon was a 55-pound concrete block found near the body.
His trunk was full of concrete particles. That was exciting at the outset because you saw all this concrete, but the trick was, can you match the concrete to the block? Can you put that block in his trunk?
The process was tedious since there were hundreds of particles recovered from Andronowicz's trunk, all very small.
Because the murder weapon was rough, because it was a broken piece of concrete, you're looking for, like a jigsaw puzzle, a piece that would fit onto it. Could you get a physical match?
But Monroe was unable to find a match. Next, police sent photographs of the victim's bite wounds to Dr. David Sweet, a forensic odontologist at the Bureau of Legal Dentistry in Vancouver. Ed Andronowicz wore dentures which were also sent for analysis.
The question that came up obviously was, can artificial teeth in the form of a complete upper and lower denture actually bite hard enough to remove human tissue?
Dr. Sweet performed a metric analysis measuring the width and arch of Andronowicz's dentures to see if they were similar to the bite wounds on Shirley Andronowicz's body. But Dr. Sweet could find few similarities.
I think at that point we were all leery of whether we had the right person or not. I know I had a question in my own mind as to whether we had the right person.
During Shirley Andronowicz's autopsy, the medical examiner had swabbed the areas around the bite wounds for possible forensic evidence. The swabs were rolled in a moistened filter paper, and the paper turned white, a positive presumptive test for the presence of saliva. The next step was to determine the blood type of the saliva.
We had a new technique at our disposal called ELISA, which allowed us to type saliva in the ABO blood typing factors.
The ELISA test revealed that the perpetrator had type B blood. This did not match Ed Adronowich's blood type.
Therefore, Mr. Adronovich, being of blood type A, could not have left the B-type saliva found on the swabs from the breast. Thereby, meaning he could not have been, in my mind, the murderer.
After 2 months in prison for a murder he confessed to, but apparently didn't commit, Andronowicz was released.
Feel better today? You happy to be outside?
But why had he confessed?
Andronowicz back at that time had a terrible problem with alcohol. And when the detectives interviewed him, and they asked him such questions as, "Did you have a fight with your wife last night?" he responded and said, "Well, I might have." And then when they went on and pressed him and said, "Well, did you hit her?" he said, "I might have."
Memory lapses while drinking are called blackouts and happen because alcohol interferes with the neurotransmissions that form memory in the brain.
And when they come out of the blackout, it's the realization, the recollection, all of a sudden that something bad may well have happened. And it's very common for alcoholics to feel remorse, express guilt, even imagine that they have done terrible things during the blackout period.
Now the police investigation had to start all over again. The murder weapon was a 55-pound piece of concrete. To forensic geologist Richard Monroe, it appeared to be about 5 years old and looked as if it had once been part of a bumper block used in parking lots. Monroe decided to visit the murder scene to survey the area. He went around midnight to evaluate the scene the way it appeared at the time of the murder. Standing where the body was discovered, Monroe wondered what exactly took place. If the victim had been strangled and was unconscious, what happened next? Where did the concrete block come from? Then Monroe saw it, an illuminated area about 500 feet away. In the shadows, Monroe found a piece of concrete. About 12 feet away was another piece. Both were similar to the murder weapon. The killer had been drawn to the area by lighting, his only visual cue. To prove his theory, Monroe needed to find out whether the murder weapon and the pieces in the schoolyard had once been part of the same block. Monroe performed a petrographic examination. Petrography is the term for identification of minerals. Concrete is made of sand, cement, water, and pieces of stone, which is poured into molds to form the bumper blocks. As it dries, the mixed design settles into a distinctive pattern, which is visually different in each concrete block. When Monroe compared the murder weapon to the other concrete pieces found in the schoolyard, the mixed design and position of the stones were identical.
The fit was almost like a glove. When you get broken aggregates in your sand and gravel inside your concrete, it'll break, and it's usually an irregular surface, and you'll have some what they call class small stones that will break out of the concrete mold, and what you're trying to do is fit that in. And it's not just one fit, it's a collection of fits.
Monroe suspected that the murder weapon might contain a fingerprint. But lifting a print from a porous surface like concrete is extremely difficult.
It's almost like a fingerprint is sitting on top of a bed of nails. So your latent material, which is very, very thin, is sitting on top of something that is very, very tenuous.
As a last resort, Monroe decided to try a technique usually used to find prints on non-porous surfaces called superglue fuming. Superglue is made of cyanoacrylate ester. A drop of superglue is placed into a chamber along with the item containing the print, and the chamber is heated for up to 6 hours. By heating the superglue, fumes condense and adhere to biological materials such as the oils of a fingerprint. Under a laser light, the biological material fluoresces, producing a clear image of the print. Monroe followed these steps with the concrete, placing both the superglue and the concrete in a vacuum chamber. But the color of the concrete is the same as the cyanoacrylate. In order to see a print, Monroe needed to find a chemical that would attach itself to the cyanoacrylate. After a number of tries, Monroe finally found one that worked. It was a biological stain known as Sudan black. Monroe found what he was looking for, the killer's fingerprint, but it was badly smudged.
Unfortunately, with the circumstances of the event, with the end of it being used as a pile driver and repeated blows on the victim, there was a certain amount of slippage taking place with a 55-pound block on the hands.
But the discovery of the related concrete pieces in the schoolyard was important. It revealed that it was a crime of opportunity and that the perpetrator may have been on foot. But a full year passed, and the trail was turning cold. 1 year after the crime, local television stations and newspapers carried stories about the unsolved murder, hoping to jog someone's memory or conscience. The media campaign led to the break police were hoping for. One year after the brutal murder of Shirley Andronovich, an informant came forward saying that his roommate had returned home on the night of the murder with stains on his jeans and boots that looked like blood.
I'm gonna take a shot.
They lived in an apartment building across the street from the murder scene. Mark Jarman was a 29-year-old unemployed construction worker. The informant also revealed that Jarman had burned his clothes the day after the murder. Samples of Jarman's blood and saliva were sent to the forensic lab. Tests revealed that Mark Jarman had type B blood, the same blood type as the saliva found on the victim. Photographs and impressions of Jarman's teeth were also sent for analysis. Jarman had a distinctive wear pattern that had ground the biting edge of the upper and lower teeth into a flattened surface. There were also some unusual spaces between the teeth, and several chipped areas had not been restored.
As a result of some of the testing that I did and the comparison with the suspect's teeth, I was able to determine that his teeth were in fact consistent with causing these marks. Or another way to explain that is his teeth could not be excluded in this case as causing those marks.
Finally, police had a shopping list they found in the schoolyard on the night of the murder. It was a big schoolyard, and police weren't sure whether the shopping list had any connection to the murder. On the shopping list was a fingerprint. That print belonged to Mark Jarman, placing him in the schoolyard around the time of the murder. After initially denying he was involved, Mark Jarman eventually confessed. Jarman said he was at the same bar as Shirley and Ed Andronowicz on the night of the murder, but he didn't speak to them. He said he ran into Shirley Andronowicz later near the high school while she was out walking.
Didn't I see you at the bar before?
Jarman said they talked and had consensual sex. Jarman said he killed Shirley Andronowicz when she threatened to tell her husband. Jarman said he emptied the contents of her purse to make the scene appear to be a robbery. But investigators didn't believe Jarman's entire story. Staff Sergeant Dan Rawn is a blood spatter expert who studied the crime scene photos and noticed an inconsistency in Jarman's story. The distance blood travels from a head wound struck by an object the size and weight of a cement block is 10 to 12 feet, creating medium velocity impact spatter. On the papers found within 10 to 12 feet of Shirley Andronowicz's body, Ron discovered medium velocity impact spatter.
The pictures of the evidence actually showed that the contents of her purse had been strewn around at some location in a position where they were exposed to the bloodletting.
Which meant that Shirley Andronowicz's purse was ransacked before she was murdered, not afterwards. Mark Jarman was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 25 years.
He took my mother. I was 14 years old. It's almost half my life. You know, I've been without her now. And you can't, I don't know how I'm ever supposed to forgive somebody for doing such a terrible thing to me. There isn't a punishment severe enough that we can give this guy for taking something like that from us. Not a day goes by when she doesn't come into my mind. I just think about what it would have been like if she was still here. I miss her.
Sometime during a neighborhood Christmas party in 1989, 5-year-old Melissa Brannon disappeared.
Loved it. She really did. We had a great time, but it's late. We're gonna do this. Melissa, will you go get the coats?
None of the adults or other children at the party saw where she went or noticed anything unusual. It took science to see what witnesses did not. Tammy Brannon and her 5-year-old daughter Melissa had moved from Texas into this suburban apartment complex in Lorton, Virginia. Tammy was a single mother recently divorced, working as an accountant and beginning a new phase in her life.
Tammy is a very good mother. She's a very sweet, very caring person. Kept to herself, more or less. You know, she wasn't what I would call extremely outgoing, although she did participate in just about everything.
One of the attractive features of the apartment complex was the active social program for the residents. Every Friday night was some sort of social gathering in the clubhouse, and during the holidays, there were special events.
The night of December 3rd at the Christmas party, that's something that they basically did for almost every holiday. People looked forward to it. They always had a nice layout within the clubhouse, and people spent time getting to know their neighbors.
Tammy Brannan and her daughter Melissa both attended that Christmas party in 1989. Altogether, about 200 residents of the complex were there.
Everybody was very upbeat, having a very good time. The children played with each other all through the night, going around and snatching all the food and having a good time.
When it was time to leave, Tammy asked Melissa to get their coats.
Oh, man. You know how that is. Oh,
Yeah. Oh, sure. And there were
Really
holidays and
amazing.
stuff.
It's ridiculous.
They have packages and everything else.
Shortly after handing the coat to her mother, Melissa disappeared.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas to
Yeah.
you, too.
Yeah. I've got to get going here.
Yeah, it's gonna be a late.
Oh, I know. I got to find
Cleaning up for everything.
Yeah, where's Melissa? She was just here a minute ago.
Tammy looked for her daughter throughout the clubhouse.
Melissa. Yeah, where's Melissa?
In a utility room off the lobby, marked private, a full-length window leading to the outside was wide open. The window faced a wooded area behind the apartment complex.
It's a possibility that somebody could have went out that window and not been seen by anybody outside. And it's in an area where it's secluded, so the inside partygoers wouldn't have seen anybody exiting to that window also.
Fairfax County Police searched the entire area and questioned everyone who attended the party.
It was very cold out that night. It was pretty imperative that we try to locate her as quickly as possible. It's hard to imagine a young child with a dress on and a small coat surviving the temperature that night.
Although no one at the party noticed anything unusual, police feared that Melissa had been abducted. Tammy Brannan pleaded for her daughter's safe return during a televised news conference.
The person who took Melissa, I beg you to please call somebody, anybody, and tell us where she is. No matter what's happened, she's all that I have. Please bring her back to me. Melissa, if you can hear Mommy and get to a telephone, call our number like I taught you to, and call me. We love you and miss you very much. Please come back to us. Mommy's waiting.
All the way down to Davisport Road.
Police could find no trace of 5-year-old Melissa Brannan, despite the help of hundreds of volunteers.
We had hundreds of police officers down there. We had hundreds of people from the military bases. We had people volunteering their airplanes, their helicopters. The search was phenomenal. It just showed how this case touched so many people.
Yellow ribbons were placed throughout the neighborhood, a symbol of concern and hope for Melissa's safe return. Police questioned Melissa's father, who was in Texas on the night of Melissa's disappearance. He was immediately ruled out as a suspect.
I also asked that if the person who took my daughter can hear me, please let her go. We love her very much. If anyone has any information that may help, please contact someone who will pass the information on to us. Thank you.
Police questioned everyone who lived at the apartment complex, as well as all of the employees. Caleb Hughes worked at the apartment as a maintenance man and attended the Christmas party. Police interviewed Hughes at his home a few hours after the party, around 2 a.m.
Mr. Hughes? Mr. Caleb Hughes? I'm Sergeant Garcia from the Fairfax Police Department. I'd like to ask you a couple questions about the party at the apartment complex that you worked at.
They asked him where he had been since leaving the apartment complex.
What'd you do after you left the party?
I drove straight home. I stopped off for a six-pack. I got home about 12:30, 1:45.
He said he stopped just before he got home, near his house. Well, if you got home at 12:30, 1:45, they stopped selling beer in Virginia at 12 o'clock. So he didn't stop for beer. He couldn't.
What did you do after you got home?
I did chores, laundry, stuff, you know, stuff like that.
Do you mind if we look around?
No, go ahead.
During the search, police noticed something unusual. Hughes told police he had been doing his laundry, but the clothes he was washing were the ones he wore to the party.
Do you always wash your sneakers with your clothes, Mr. Hughes?
He was also washing his belt and the knife holder.
Said, why would you wash all your clothes? You don't have another pair of blue jeans? And why would you wash your sneakers? Caleb had no response.
The side of Hughes' sneakers had been shaved away. Although the sneakers had been washed, tests showed traces of human protein, possibly blood, deep in the fibers. Caleb Hughes wasn't cooperating either. Hughes told police he did not speak to Melissa Brannon at the Christmas party, but several witnesses contradicted him.
Did you have something to eat?
Said, Caleb, I think you know more. I think you took Melissa out of that party. And all Caleb would do is just sit there, and finally Caleb said, prove it. Looked me straight in the face, had no emotion at all.
And that's what investigators set out to do. Weeks passed, and still there were no signs of 5-year-old Melissa Brannon. The community of Lorton, Virginia held a candlelight vigil at the Brannons' apartment complex, just a few feet from the clubhouse where Melissa was abducted. Bumper stickers, yellow ribbons, and flyers with Melissa's picture were everywhere.
It was all anybody talked about, because this wasn't one girl and one family. This was any child, all of our families. If this could happen to Tammy Brannon's daughter, this could happen to anyone's daughter. And there was a desperate outcry to find who would have taken this child.
The remaining suspect was Caleb Hughes. Hughes attended the Christmas party, but he denied having anything to do with Melissa's disappearance. Forensic scientists began their investigation with a look inside Hughes' car.
The interior of the car was cluttered with a lot of debris, dirt, bags of books, dog hair. I just looked at it and thought, holy mackerel, how am I going to be able to find any type of evidence that would link Melissa to this car?
The car was sprayed with the chemical luminol, which fluoresces when it comes into contact with the hemoglobin component of blood. Luminol revealed blood on the steering wheel, foot pedals, and floor mat. The blood was collected for DNA analysis, but the results were inconclusive. The car was also searched for trace evidence, specifically hair and fibers, and was sent to Special Agent Doug Dietrich of the FBI for analysis.
First thing that I do is look at the tapings that came from the front seat of the car, trying to identify what types of materials are there, and if possible, anything that may have come from the victim, if she had been in that car.
Dietrich discovered quite a bit of animal hair in the car, most of it dog hair. But 3 of the hairs from Hughes' front seat were different. They were rabbit hairs that had been dyed black. The rabbit hairs were microscopically similar to a German rabbit hair coat Tammy Brannon wore to that Christmas party.
When Tammy Brannon was leaving the apartment, she told Melissa to get her fur coat. Melissa got the fur coat, and as a child will do, she draped that coat across her shoulders. And of course, those hairs from that coat, certain of them transfer to her.
Dietrich also discovered blue and red fibers on Hughes' front passenger seat. The red fibers were cotton, an extremely common fiber, but the blue fibers were extremely rare. The 50 blue fibers were man-made and acrylic. They were all the same shape, length, and diameter, an indication they were from the same manufacturer. Gas chromatography revealed that the blue fibers were dyed with the same blue dye, but the chemical composition of the blue dye was unusual. Melissa Brannon was wearing a blue sweater and red plaid skirt on the night she disappeared. The outfit had been a gift from Melissa's grandmother, who could not recall where she bought it. All she could remember was that the sweater had a picture of Big Bird on it, a character from the Sesame Street television series. Prosecutors needed more evidence than the 3 rabbit hairs from Mrs. Brannon's coat found in Caleb Hughes' car. They knew that any good defense attorney would argue that Caleb Hughes could have brushed up against Tammy Brannon's coat at the party and transferred those rabbit hairs onto the seat of his car. Doug Dietrich was convinced that the blue fibers held the key to Melissa Brannon's disappearance, but there was no way to tell if the fibers were from Melissa's clothing. After work one night, Doug Dietrich shared his frustration with his wife. He told her he needed to find the manufacturer of the outfit Melissa was wearing at the Christmas party.
Some sort of blue Winnie the Pooh thing, or a Sesame Street outfit with a red plaid skirt.
I don't know anything about Winnie the Pooh, but if it's Sesame Street, that's sold by J.C. Penney. Hold on a second.
Mrs. Dietrich had kept a number of store catalogs, some going back a few years.
Red plaid skirt?
I see that.
She proceeded to bring a catalog down from the year before Christmas, and sure enough, on page 11 of that catalog, there was an outfit that looked darn close to what they were describing to me as the one Melissa Brannon wore the night of her disappearance.
When Tammy Brannon was shown the picture from the catalog, she identified it as the one Melissa was wearing at the party. The FBI asked J.C. Penney for one of the outfits in order to analyze the fibers, but they were sold out. The item was a catalog-only item. J.C. Penney sold all 7,000 garments in a matter of months. But J.C. Penney located a customer in Kentucky who had purchased one of these outfits a year earlier. The customer bought the outfit as a present for his granddaughter, but it was the wrong size, so it had never been worn. The customer sent the outfit to the FBI for analysis.
The idea of just being able to find an outfit that's exactly the same outfit that a victim wore in a case, that's an extremely good stroke of luck.
When Doug Dietrich examined the garment, he made a startling discovery. When J.C. Penney had this outfit manufactured, they wanted to make it unique. Instead of using a standard dye, and there are 10,000 of them, Penney's decided to create a brand new color.
J.C. Penney specifies a particular color. Then they'll work with the dye manufacturer to find some combination of chemicals that will produce exactly that tone. In this particular case, they went an additional step and made sure that it was a dye that nobody else had access to, so that they could trademark the sweater from its color point of view.
They called their new color Plum Navy number 887. J.C. Penney patented that signature dye and used it only once, when they produced the 7,000 Big Bird sweaters. When Dietrich compared the fibers from the duplicate sweater to those found in Hughes' automobile, they were the same.
With several 100 million people in the country and only 7,000 sweaters, the probability of that particular sweater being located in an individual car is very small. You can just work out the ratios of the two.
And there's no question in my mind that Melissa Brannon had been in the front seat of Cal Hughes' car. And where she went from there, well, I guess that's a mystery right now.
A mystery police were desperately trying to solve. The search for Melissa Brannon's body continued for almost a year. Statistics show that children abducted by strangers are usually murdered within 3 hours of the abduction. The prime suspect, Caleb Hughes, was asked to take a polygraph test.
Are you the one who abducted Melissa? No. Right now, can you take me to Melissa's body? No.
The results of his polygraph examination indicated deception.
As soon as he realized that I knew that he had failed that test, he didn't want anything to do with that room, didn't want anything to do with me, and pretty much bolted out of there.
But there was a problem. In the state of Virginia, prosecutors must be able to prove where a homicide occurred. Since the blood in Caleb Hughes' automobile could not be identified as Melissa's, prosecutors could not reach the threshold of homicide. They could only prove kidnapping, which carried a maximum sentence of only 10 years. But prosecutors were convinced that the blue and red fibers in Caleb Hughes' car indicated more than kidnapping.
The last Tammy Brannon saw her daughter, she was wearing the pink nylon coat, winter coat, over top of this Big Bird outfit. If the child remained in that winter coat in the automobile, you wouldn't have the collection and the population of blue acrylic fibers that are found on the seat, because they'd be inside the nylon coat. They weren't.
Prosecutors believe that Hughes removed Melissa's ski jacket in the car, an indication that Hughes committed a sex act.
Hughes had the child's coat off in the automobile, and it seems to me the inferences that flow from that are legitimate inferences of an intent to defile.
While Melissa was waiting for her mother to say her goodbyes at the Christmas party, prosecutors believe that she left for a moment to get a drink from the water fountain in the hallway near the utility room. This is where Hughes abducted her. Hughes took Melissa through the window in the utility room and fled in his car. Hughes removed Melissa's ski jacket in the car, causing the transfer of the blue and red fibers onto the front seat. Also in the car, there were 3 rabbit hairs from Tammy Brannon's coat, the one Melissa handed her mother seconds before she was abducted. Where Hughes took Melissa Brannon and left her body remains a mystery. Hughes tracked blood onto his foot pedals and floor mat from his sneakers. Luminol revealed blood on the car's steering wheel as well. When Hughes arrived home, he immediately washed his clothes in order to remove trace evidence. He also scraped away the blood stain from the sides of his sneakers before washing them along with his clothes. But he didn't remove evidence that he couldn't see. The tiny fibers from Melissa's clothing left on the passenger seat of his car. Caleb Hughes was arrested and charged, not with kidnapping, but with the abduction of Melissa Brannon with intent to defile her. He was found guilty and sentenced to 50 years in prison without parole, the maximum sentence. Caleb Hughes has never confessed to the crime, and the search for Melissa's body continues to this day.
Each piece of evidence, no matter how small, whether it's a car or whether it's a strand of DNA, all have a story to tell. Where they've been, who they've been with, how long they've been around. And this is the type of information that I look at and that I decipher and try to determine what value it has. So one piece of evidence can be significant when you add multiple pieces of this puzzle, and you never get the whole puzzle. You only get pieces, but you don't need the whole puzzle to see what that picture's going to say. And in this case, 50 fibers, blue acrylic, 10 cotton, black rabbit hairs, to me, is overwhelming evidence.
Sometime during a neighborhood Christmas party in 1989, 5-year-old Melissa Brannon disappeared.
Loved it. She really did. We had a great time, but it's late. We're gonna do this. Melissa, will you go get the coats?
None of the adults or other children at the party saw where she went or noticed anything unusual. It took science to see what witnesses did not. Tammy Brannon and her 5-year-old daughter Melissa had moved from Texas into this suburban apartment complex in Lorton, Virginia. Tammy was a single mother recently divorced, working as an accountant and beginning a new phase in her life.
Tammy is a very good mother. She's a very sweet, very caring person. Kept to herself, more or less. She wasn't what I would call extremely outgoing, although she did participate in just about everything.
One of the attractive features of the apartment complex was the active social program for the residents. Every Friday night was some sort of social gathering in the clubhouse, and during the holidays, there were special events.
The night of December 3rd at the Christmas party, that's something that they basically did for almost every holiday. People looked forward to it. They always had a nice layout within the clubhouse, and people spent time getting to know their neighbors.
Tammy Brannon and her daughter Melissa both attended that Christmas party in 1989. Altogether, about 200 residents of the complex were there.
Everybody was very upbeat, having a very good time. The children played with each other all through the night, going around and snatching all the food and having a good time.
When it was time to leave, Tammy asked Melissa to get their coats.
Oh, man.
Sure. And then with the holidays and stuff, it's ridiculous. You have packages and everything else.
Shortly after handing the coat to her mother, Melissa disappeared.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas,
Yeah.
too.
Yeah. I've got to get going here.
Okay. Yeah, it's gonna be a late.
Oh, I know. I got to find
Cleaning up forever.
Where's Melissa? She was just here a minute ago.
Tammy looked for her daughter throughout the clubhouse. In a utility room off the lobby, marked private, a full-length window leading to the outside was wide open. The window faced a wooded area behind the apartment complex.
It's a possibility that somebody could have went out that window and not been seen by anybody outside. And it's in an area where it's secluded, so the inside partygoers wouldn't have seen anybody exiting to that window also.
Fairfax County Police searched the entire area and questioned everyone who attended the party.
It was very cold out that night. It was pretty imperative that we try to locate her as quickly as possible. It's hard to imagine a young child with a dress on and a small coat surviving the temperature that night.
Although no one at the party noticed anything unusual, police feared that Melissa had been abducted. Tammy Brannon pleaded for her daughter's safe return during a televised news conference.
The person who took Melissa, I beg you to please call somebody, anybody, and tell us where she is. No matter what's happened, she's all that I have. Please bring her back to me. Melissa, if you can hear Mommy and get to a telephone, call our number like I taught you to. And call me. We love you and miss you very much. Please come back to us. Mommy's waiting.
All the way down to Davisport Road.
Police could find no trace of 5-year-old Melissa Brannon, despite the help of hundreds of volunteers.
We had hundreds of police officers down there. We had hundreds of people from the military bases. We had people volunteering their airplanes, their helicopters. The search was phenomenal. It just showed how this case touched so many people.
Yellow ribbons were placed throughout the neighborhood, a symbol of concern and hope for Melissa's safe return. Police questioned Melissa's father, who was in Texas on the night of Melissa's disappearance. He was immediately ruled out as a suspect.
I also asked that if the person who took my daughter can hear me, please let her go. We love her very much. If anyone has any information that may help, please contact someone who will pass the information on to us. Thank you.
Police questioned everyone who lived at the apartment complex, as well as all of the employees. Caleb Hughes worked at the apartment as a maintenance man and attended the Christmas party. Police interviewed Hughes at his home a few hours after the party, around 2 a.m.
Mr. Hughes? Mr. Caleb Hughes? I'm Sergeant Garcia from the Fairfax Police Department. I'd like to ask you a couple questions about the party at the apartment complex that you work at.
They asked him where he had been since leaving the apartment complex.
What'd you do after you left the party?
I drove straight home. I stopped off for a six-pack. I got home about 12:30, 1:45.
He said he stopped just before he got home, near his house. Well, if he got home at 12:30, 1:45, they stopped selling beer in Virginia at 12 o'clock. So he didn't stop for beer. He couldn't.
What'd you do after you got home?
I did chores, laundry, stuff, you know, stuff like that.
You mind if we look around?
No, go ahead.
During the search, police noticed something unusual. Hughes told police he had been doing his laundry, but the clothes he was washing were the ones he wore to the party.
Do you always wash your sneakers with your clothes, Mr. Hughes?
He was also washing his belt and the knife holder.
Said, why would you wash all your clothes? You don't have another pair of blue jeans? And why would you wash your sneakers? Caleb had no response.
The side of Hughes' sneakers had been shaved away. Although the sneakers had been washed, tests showed traces of human protein, possibly blood, deep in the fibers. Caleb Hughes wasn't cooperating either. Hughes told police he did not speak to Melissa Brannon at the Christmas party, but several witnesses contradicted him.
Did you have something to eat?
He said, Caleb, I think you know more. I think you took Melissa out of that party. And all Caleb would do was just sit there, and finally Caleb said, prove it. Looked me straight in the face, had no emotion at all.
And that's what investigators set out to do. Weeks passed, and still there were no signs of 5-year-old Melissa Brannon. The community of Lorton, Virginia held a candlelight vigil at the Brannons' apartment complex, just a few feet from the clubhouse where Melissa was abducted. Bumper stickers, yellow ribbons, and flyers with Melissa's picture were everywhere.
It was all anybody talked about, because this wasn't one girl and one family. This was any child, all of our families. If this could happen to Tammy Brannon's daughter, this could happen to anyone's daughter. And there was a desperate outcry to find who would have taken this child.
The remaining suspect was Caleb Hughes. Hughes attended the Christmas party, but he denied having anything to do with Melissa's disappearance. Forensic scientists began their investigation with a look inside Hughes' car.
The interior of the car was cluttered with a lot of debris, dirt, bags of books, dog hair. I just looked at it and thought, holy mackerel, how am I going to be able to find any type of evidence that would link Melissa to this car?
The car was sprayed with the chemical luminol, which fluoresces when it comes into contact with the hemoglobin component of blood. Luminol revealed blood on the steering wheel, foot pedals, and floor mat. The blood was collected for DNA analysis, but the results were inconclusive. The car was also searched for trace evidence, specifically hair and fibers, and was sent to Special Agent Doug Dietrich of the FBI for analysis.
First thing that I do is look at the tapings that came from the front seat of the car, trying to identify what types of materials are there, and if possible, anything that may have come from the victim if she had been in that car.
Dietrich discovered quite a bit of animal hair in the car, most of it dog hair. But 3 of the hairs from Hugh's front seat were different. They were rabbit hairs that had been dyed black. The rabbit hairs were microscopically similar to a German rabbit hair coat Tammy Brannan wore to that Christmas party.
When Tammy Brannan was leaving the apartment, she told Melissa to get her fur coat. Melissa got the fur coat, and as a child will do, she draped that coat across her shoulders. And of course, those hairs from that coat, certain of them transfer to her.
Dietrich also discovered blue and red fibers on Hugh's front passenger seat. The red fibers were cotton, an extremely common fiber, but the blue fibers were extremely rare. The 50 blue fibers were man-made and acrylic. They were all the same shape, length, and diameter, an indication they were from the same manufacturer. Gas chromatography revealed that the blue fibers were dyed with the same blue dye. But the chemical composition of the blue dye was unusual. Melissa Brannan was wearing a blue sweater and red plaid skirt on the night she disappeared. The outfit had been a gift from Melissa's grandmother, who could not recall where she bought it. All she could remember was that the sweater had a picture of Big Bird on it, a character from the Sesame Street television series. Prosecutors needed more evidence than the 3 rabbit hairs from Mrs. Brannan's coat found in Caleb Hugh's car. They knew that any good defense attorney would argue that Caleb Hughes could have brushed up against Tammy Brannan's coat at the party and transferred those rabbit hairs onto the seat of his car. Doug Dietrich was convinced that the blue fibers held the key to Melissa Brannan's disappearance, but there was no way to tell if the fibers were from Melissa's clothing. After work one night, Doug Dietrich shared his frustration with his wife. He told her he needed to find the manufacturer of the outfit Melissa was wearing at the Christmas party.
Some sort of blue Winnie the Pooh thing, or a Sesame Street outfit with a red plaid skirt.
I don't know anything about Winnie the Pooh, but if it's Sesame Street, that's sold by J.C. Penney. Hold on a second.
Mrs. Dietrich had kept a number of store catalogs, some going back a few years.
Red plaid skirt.
I see that.
She proceeded to bring a catalog down from the year before Christmas, and sure enough, on page 11 of that catalog, there was an outfit that looked darn close to what they were describing to me as the one Melissa Brannan wore the night of her disappearance.
When Tammy Brannan was shown the picture from the catalog, she identified it as the one Melissa was wearing at the party. The FBI asked J.C. Penney for one of the outfits in order to analyze the fibers, but they were sold out. The item was a catalog-only item. J.C. Penney sold all 7,000 garments in a matter of months. But J.C. Penney located a customer in Kentucky who had purchased one of these outfits a year earlier. The customer bought the outfit as a present for his granddaughter, but it was the wrong size, so it had never been worn. The customer sent the outfit to the FBI for analysis.
The idea of just being able to find an outfit that's exactly the same outfit that a victim wore in a case, that's an extremely good stroke of luck.
When Doug Dietrich examined the garment, he made a startling discovery. When J.C. Penney had this outfit manufactured, they wanted to make it unique. Instead of using a standard dye, and there are 10,000 of them, Penney's decided to create a brand new color.
J.C. Penney specifies a particular color, then they'll work with the dye manufacturer to find some combination of chemicals that will produce exactly that tone. In this particular case, they went an additional step and made sure that it was a dye that nobody else had access to so that they could trademark this sweater from its color point of view.
They called their new color Plum Navy number 887. J.C. Penney patented that signature dye and used it only once when they produced the 7,000 Big Bird sweaters. When Diedrich compared the fibers from the duplicate sweater to those found in Hughes' automobile, they were the same.
With several 100 million people in the country and only 7,000 sweaters, the probability of that particular sweater being located in an individual car is very small. You can just work out the ratios of the two.
There's no question in my mind that Melissa Brannon had been in the front seat of Cal Hughes' car. Where she went from there, well, I guess that's a mystery right now.
A mystery police were desperately trying to solve. The search for Melissa Brannon's body continued for almost a year. Statistics show that children abducted by strangers are usually murdered within 3 hours of the abduction. The prime suspect, Caleb Hughes, was asked to take a polygraph test.
Are you the one who abducted Melissa?
No.
Right now, can you take me to Melissa's body?
No.
The results of his polygraph examination indicated deception.
As soon as he realized that I knew that he had failed that test, he didn't want anything to do with that room, didn't want anything to do with me, and pretty much bolted out of there.
But there was a problem. In the state of Virginia, prosecutors must be able to prove where a homicide occurred. Since the blood in Caleb Hughes' automobile could not be identified as Melissa's, prosecutors could not reach the threshold of homicide. They could only prove kidnapping, which carried a maximum sentence of only 10 years. But prosecutors were convinced that the blue and red fibers in Caleb Hughes' car indicated more than kidnapping.
The last Tammy Brannon saw her daughter, she was wearing the pink nylon coat, winter coat, over top of this Big Bird outfit. If the child remained in that winter coat in the automobile, you wouldn't have the collection and the population of blue acrylic fibers that are found on the seat, because they'd be inside the nylon coat. They weren't.
Prosecutors believe that Hughes removed Melissa's ski jacket in the car, an indication that Hughes committed a sex act.
Hughes had the child's coat off in the automobile, and it seems to me the inferences that flow from that are legitimate inferences of an intent to defile.
While Melissa was waiting for her mother to say her goodbyes at the Christmas party, prosecutors believe that she left for a moment to get a drink from the water fountain in the hallway near the utility room. This is where Hughes abducted her. Hughes took Melissa through the window in the utility room and fled in his car. Hughes removed Melissa's ski jacket in the car, causing the transfer of the blue and red fibers onto the front seat. Also in the car, there were 3 rabbit hairs from Tammy Brannon's coat, the one Melissa handed her mother seconds before she was abducted. Where Hughes took Melissa Brannon and left her body remains a mystery. Hughes tracked blood onto his foot pedals and floor mat from his sneakers. Luminol revealed blood on the car's steering wheel as well. When Hughes arrived home, he immediately washed his clothes in order to remove trace evidence. He also scraped away the blood stain from the sides of his sneakers before washing them along with his clothes. But he didn't remove evidence that he couldn't see. The tiny fibers from Melissa's clothing left on the passenger seat of his car. Caleb Hughes was arrested and charged, not with kidnapping, but with the abduction of Melissa Brannon with intent to defile her. He was found guilty and sentenced to 50 years in prison without parole, the maximum sentence. Caleb Hughes has never confessed to the crime, and the search for Melissa's body continues to this day.
Each piece of evidence, no matter how small, whether it's a car or whether it's a strand of DNA, all have a story to tell. Where they've been, who they've been with, how long they've been around. And this is the type of information that I look at and that I decipher and try to determine what value it has. So one piece of evidence can be significant when you add multiple pieces of this puzzle, and you never get the whole puzzle. You only get pieces, but you don't need the whole puzzle to see what that picture's going to say. And in this case, 50 fibers, blue acrylic, 10 cotton, black rabbit hairs. To me, it's overwhelming evidence.
Ricky Stetson went for an evening run on a jogging trail in Portland, Maine. Witnesses recalled seeing the boy and a young man right behind him on a bicycle. The next day, Ricky Stetson's body was discovered in a nearby ravine. He had been murdered. The killer left very few clues, but he left behind something he couldn't hide: his signature. 11-year-old Ricky Stetson and his family lived in a working-class section of Portland, Maine, a coastal city known primarily as a summer vacation destination. Around 8 p.m. on August 23, 1983, Ricky went for a short run along a biking and jogging path called Black Cove. He never returned home. His body was discovered the next day in a grassy area just off the jogging path.
There was evidence, both externally and internally, as I recall, of asphyxiation, that is, of choking around the neck. And it appeared to the medical examiner as though he was choked manually and probably by a ligature.
He had also been stabbed. The autopsy revealed that the boy had not been sexually assaulted, but there were bite wounds on various parts of his body. And the bite marks had been gouged with a knife.
None of the forensic dentists had seen a case before in which there had been a bite mark with slashing and cutting through it as if to hide the bite mark. And so that's what the law calls a signature crime. That is, it is done in a way that is very unique, that is very unusual, that the culprit, the perpetrator, is leaving, as it were, his signature on the crime.
To Portland police, Ricky Stetson's murder appeared similar to a series of knifings that occurred 2 years earlier in the Oakdale section of the city. Michael Witham was just 9 years old when he had an encounter with the so-called Oakdale slasher.
There's a wooded lot between a couple of houses which have a couple of paths, and I was called into the wooded lot by a guy who I didn't know at the time. He had asked me a few questions: my age, my name, where I lived, and after I had asked his questions, he said I could leave. As I turned to leave, he grabbed me and cut my throat.
Witham got away, but the injury was just inches from being fatal and required 12 stitches to close. All Witham could say was the attacker was a white male in his late teens or early 20s. That description was similar to the one of the man seen riding his bicycle behind Ricky Stetson. For a full year, police searched for the killer, and eventually they identified a suspect, 24-year-old Joseph Anderson. He was also a suspect in the attempted murder of a 9-year-old girl. But there was a problem. Police in Bellevue, Nebraska had a similar murder. A 13-year-old boy with stab wounds and markings identical to Ricky Stetson's. If the Nebraska murder was related to the Stetson case in Maine, Joseph Anderson wasn't the killer. A serial murderer was on the loose on a 1,500-mile killing spree. In the fall of 1983, police in Bellevue, Nebraska were searching for a missing 13-year-old boy, Danny Joe Eberly. Danny Joe had been delivering newspapers early one Sunday morning when he mysteriously disappeared.
He's partially through his paper route and now has disappeared. And he wasn't with any of his playmates, any of his relatives, wasn't in any of the neighborhoods, and we knew something was terribly wrong right then.
Danny Joe's bicycle was found in front of a home he delivered newspapers to, but there was no sign of a struggle and no sign of the boy.
Danny's bicycle. His brother and sister and his mother and dad said his whole life was that bicycle. That's why he delivered newspapers, to buy accessories and to keep the bicycle shining. He was really proud of it.
Police searched for Danny Joe Eberly across the state of Nebraska. His picture was seen on nightly television programs and in the newspapers. 3 days later, investigators' worst fears were realized. Danny Joe Eberly's body was found on a desolate stretch of road 4 miles from his bicycle. He had been stabbed to death. The town's mayor, Joe Baldwin, personally delivered the news to the boy's mother.
We broke the news to her, and we were all crying, including the FBI guy. He was crying. He was crying, and I was crying. The chief was crying. A very traumatic type thing to tell some woman, your son was found and he's dead. The very most traumatic thing I think I've ever done.
Danny Joe Eberly's hands and feet were tied with rope, and a star-shaped pattern had been cut into his chest, but there was no sign of sexual assault. Police turned to FBI behavioral analyst Robert Ressler for a psychological profile of the killer.
We had a biter, an individual who was compelled to bite his victims and then cutting the flesh away to deny that evidence to the police.
Since the body was found so close to the road, Ressler suspected the killer was slightly built and not strong enough to carry the body very far. The location also told Ressler that the killer was inexperienced.
That it was right off the side of the road really would indicate to me that the killer was in a little state of panic, wanted to get rid of the body, didn't want to be found with a body in the car, but wasn't sophisticated or knowledgeable enough about the area to do it effectively. And it would indicate to me possibly that this may have been the first time that he had killed in this particular area.
The rope used to bind Danny Joe Eberly was of particular interest to investigators and was sent to FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C. Special Agent Wayne Oakes conducted the analysis.
I had never seen anyone like this. None of the other examiners in the laboratory who deal with ropes on a daily basis over a number of years had ever seen a rope like this.
The outside of the rope was common white nylon, but the inner core was extremely unusual. There were 24 different types of fibers and 106 different colored yarns. There were polyesters, nylons, rayons, acrylics, polyethylenes, wools, and cottons, which is what made the rope unique. Oakes took the rope to the National Cordage Institute, a trade association of all rope manufacturers in the United States. Their technical experts had never seen a rope like this either. Back in Bellevue, Nebraska, police were desperate to find the killer of Danny Joe Eberly, and parents were warned to keep a close eye on their children.
People are reluctant to let their children out to go sledding or skating or any of the normal activities. Children are watched over at shopping centers. The parents are keeping a very tight rein on their children for their safety.
Despite the precautions, the unthinkable happened again. Another young boy, 12-year-old Christopher Walden, was abducted as he walked to school.
It was about 8 blocks from his house, again in Bellevue, and he was at a 4-way stop when a young man came up and forced him into the car and drove off with him.
In the sub-zero temperatures, police searched for Christopher Walden. 3 days later, a group of pheasant hunters stumbled upon a snow-covered figure. Christopher Walden's frozen body was found in the same area as Danny Joe Eberly's. Like Danny Joe, Walden had been stabbed to death, and he had the same star-shaped pattern etched on his body. Two sets of footprints led into the woods where Christopher Walden's body was discovered, but only one set of footprints left the scene, an indication the killer did not have an accomplice. The star-shaped pattern told investigators that this was the same individual who killed Danny Joe Eberly 3 months earlier. Witnesses saw Christopher Walden with a young white male in his early 20s on the walkway near the school. From those descriptions, police created a composite drawing, which was distributed to newspapers and local television stations. Robert Ressler refined his profile of the killer with information gathered from the second murder.
I felt that the individual, because of this need to be close to young males and having attraction for them, that he would be involved in some sort of activities with youth. Soccer coach, baseball coach, Boy Scouts.
Since the killer was using a knife to obscure the bite wounds, Ressler suspected that the killer read police and detective magazines because matching bite wounds to a dental impression is often discussed in these types of publications. Police talked to a woman who was walking her dog near the intersection at the time Christopher Walden was abducted. She thought she saw the abduction, but she wasn't entirely sure. So police asked her to undergo hypnosis. Hypnosis can sometimes help a witness to recall details of an event they can't otherwise remember, but hypnotically enhanced recollections are usually not admissible in court.
She underwent hypnosis, and something came out in the session, and it was just driving her crazy, and it all came back to her. And that's when she realized that she had seen Christopher Walden being kidnapped.
She said that Christopher Walden was with a man who was approximately the same height. The car leaving the scene was brown. The license number started with the letter R, followed by a series of numbers. Sheriff Patrick Thomas issued a challenge to the killer during a news conference.
And I think that the individual who's responsible for these acts is very sick, spineless, a coward, and I would urge him to call a minister or a priest or me. There was a lot of Monday morning quarterbacking from then on that maybe this shouldn't have been done, or maybe whatever. But I felt that I would see what he's made of, because I knew that he was watching the press, he was watching TV, he was monitoring us as much as they do. That's part of their profile, that's part of their MO. And I figured that maybe he would make a mistake.
And it worked. A local woman Barbara Weaver told friends that she had been praying for the capture of the serial murderer, and she did something else. In her prayers, she offered herself in any way possible to help find the killer. Barbara Weaver worked in a daycare center, and she usually arrived at work early to get her classroom ready. When she looked outside, she noticed a strange car in the parking lot. The driver was wearing a ski cap and looked similar to the composite drawings of the killer she saw on television. As she was writing down the license plate number, the man entered the classroom. He threatened to kill her and pulled a knife. Mrs. Weaver ran past him and fled to the house next door, which belonged to the pastor of the church. From there, she called police.
She writes down his license tag. That's the first thing she did. Sharp woman. But the fact of it is, she got to say, when she saw the car, she said, that looks like the car of this killer. Remember, this is all that's on everyone's mind. This is the biggest case they've ever had in Nebraska.
Police tracked the license plate number to a 19-year-old enlisted man stationed at Offutt Air Force Base. His name was John Joubert. Joubert was a maintenance mechanic in the radar unit. He was also an Eagle Scout and was an assistant scout leader for a local troop. Joubert denied having anything to do with the two murders. But there was an interesting coincidence. Joubert had been living in Portland, Maine the year before at the time of Ricky Stetson's murder. When John Joubert was questioned about the murders of Danny Joe Eberly and Christopher Walden, he had little to say to investigators. But he fit the FBI's profile of the killer. He was 19 years old, slightly built, and an Eagle Scout who volunteered his time as an assistant scout leader of a local troop. Joubert read softcore pornography and detective magazines, which were found in his footlocker at the Air Force Base. But what police found in his automobile was of particular interest. On the right floorboard was a brown Caucasian head hair, which was sent to the FBI for analysis.
A microscopic examination of the question hairs found from the vacuum sweepings in the vehicle with the known standards from the victim, they were the same microscopically. And I indicated in my report that the hairs in the vehicle were consistent with head hairs from the victim, Danny Joe Eberly.
Police also found a knife and a roll of tape. And in Joubert's automobile was a piece of rope. At first, it appeared to be common nylon rope, similar to the type sold in thousands of retail outlets throughout the United States. But inside the rope was a surprise.
The core of the rope was so unique, with 106 different fibers in there. Every single one of those fibers was mounted on a glass microscope, and the generic class of fiber was identified to make sure that they were same color, composition, diameter, cross-sectional shape, and to make sure that the acetates matched the acetates and the polyethylenes matched the polyethylenes. I found that they were identical in all respects, microscopically, instrumentally, chemical tests. There were no differences between the two ropes.
Joubert had no idea the rope was so rare. He said he had been given the rope years earlier in the Boy Scouts. When confronted with the evidence, Joubert confessed.
He said, "Let me tell you about the second boy first, because it's fresher in my mind." And we started questioning him, and he told us and provided us with facts concerning the killings and the abduction of both boys that would only be known to the individual that had committed the crimes.
Joubert also admitted that he was the Oakdale slasher, and his attacks on people like Michael Witham were practice for his subsequent killing spree. He also revealed that after killing Danny Joe Eberly, he walked into a McDonald's restaurant, washed the blood from his hands in the men's room, and ordered some breakfast. After the Christopher Walden murder, Joubert said he attended a Boy Scout meeting where he was an assistant troop leader. At that meeting, the troop discussed the abductions.
Yeah, well, guys, you know, as long as you look out for each other, you have nothing to worry about. Okay?
After 116 days and one of the most intensive manhunts in Nebraska history, police finally had their killer, and Portland, Maine had theirs as well. In Maine, Joubert was sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Ricky Stetson. In Nebraska, for the murders of Danny Joe Eberly and Christopher Walden, Joubert was convicted and sentenced to death.
I specifically asked him if he disliked the boys, and his statement was, "How could I dislike him? I didn't even know him."
No one knows what drove John Joubert to kill.
And I remember one day I said, John, if I let you out of jail today and just let you walk away from here, do you think you've learned now that you would never do that again? And he says, he thought for quite some time, and he says, no, he says, I don't think I could help myself. I says, do you mean you'd go kill another little boy? Yeah, probably, he said. Yeah, I probably would.
On July 17th, 1996, John Joubert was put to death in the electric chair. Joubert's presence is still felt to this day in the small town of Bellevue. Former Mayor Joe Baldwin regularly visits the victims' graves and remembers the 116 days when a serial killer stalked his community.
Most horrible thing that ever happened in this city, you know, to have a young person like that, 2 young persons, and even 3 when you talk about, to have their life taken away by a person like that, I think that is terrible. You can't believe how traumatic it is when it happens.
Just the other day in a grocery store, a lady said that she's just fearful of her little boy playing after dark, that she remembers Joubert. She says, I don't know how to instill in him that it may happen again. And I told her, I hope and pray to never it happen again, but make sure she keeps an eye on her little boy.
You just have to be careful. Children have to be very careful. There are people out there that prey on them.